Welcome back. This is the last of many panels that we organized in order to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, where we try to continuously and in many different ways make a case for the fact that art has a political impact and political resonance and is closely tied to political developments in many different ways. This afternoon we were delighted to present the finalists for the Vera List Center Prize for Art and Politics. In the earlier panel it was a presentation by Forensic Architecture and by Gulf Labor. And now I'm really thrilled that we are going to hear presentations from 3 of the other finalists. They are the House of Natural Fiber. They are IsumaTV and MadeYouLook. It's also a particular pleasure to have Amanda Palmer, the curator of the Vera List Center, moderate this panel, and she will take over in just a minute. But let me quickly mention that the speakers this afternoon are Irena Agrivina and Ratna Duyveta from House of Natural Fiber, just to Amanda's right. Then there is Samuel Cohn-Cousineau from IsumaTV, and further down on the very right are Nare Makoto and Mole Molaya of MadeYouLook. And with that, let's dive in immediately. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So we're going to begin in a minute with presentations from each of you. And so each presentation will last for about 10 minutes in order to present your practices, and then we'll go into a conversation between all of us. But I just wanted to start out by saying that something we talked about earlier today was the way in which these practices are not necessarily producing new knowledge, but producing new intersections of knowledge and context. And we're thinking a lot about the ways in which those intersections are jarring our awareness and recognition of what kind of thought and investment and desires can be produced through artistic practices. So we're going to begin with House of Natural Fiber. Irene Agrivina and Ratna Duyveta are here on behalf of House of Natural Fiber. They're part of a group that was begun in 1999 that's been concentrating on principles of critique and innovation and thinking forward positivity and creativity towards the development of art, science, and technology for society. In explaining this work this morning, they were talking about this idea of citizen science. And so I'm going to pass this on to you, and then I'll go on to introduce each of the other panelists with their presentation.
So, hello. So, I'm Irena Agrivina and Ratna Duyveta. For us, it's very honored to be here, and we present House of Natural Fiber. We call it HONF. And we started in 1999. So it's actually, we started as a media arts laboratory. And then, and we use DIY and do it with other methods. And it's gathered from hacktivists, designers, scientists, and artists, so we gather together to produce like some works. And this is where we started, actually a very romantic garage, where almost 30 people there for almost 24 hours. And then since 2011, we have 3 labs. One is FUFOC, is Extraterrestrial Study Center, focusing on space science. And then we have Fab Lab, or Fab Lab Yogyakarta, that focusing on digital fabrication, and we have Fun Factory that focusing on media studies and discourses. And then this is a video, a little short video that can explain. Yeah, so there are some slides that show our activities. Maybe it's also too fast, but so our background is actually we're combining between art, science, and technology, and we have a curriculum that we developed since 1999. It's called Education Focus Program. Yeah, it's concentrate on interdisciplinary knowledge exchange and collaborations in critical analysis toward local and global issues, and actually we are seeking also to give a solution for urgent needs for people in Indonesia. And yeah, so we explore interaction between life, art, science, and free technology through practical aesthetic ways. So our project is not only reflects on impacts of communication, media, and other technology and social and natural environment in Indonesia and worldwide, but we also provide scenarios for alternative solutions for future and innovative solutions. Yeah, this is some projects in our lab. This is actually the workshops that from elementary school until universities, and this is some research that we do in our labs. And yeah, this is also another some workshops and experiments that we did. And this is a project called Low Cost Prosthesis. It's actually a collaboration between HONF and WAS Society in Amsterdam. And the aim is to make under $50 prosthesis that can be used, and we can use also local material. Then it can be adapted everywhere for people that need prosthesis, because in Indonesia prosthesis is very expensive and hard to get, but many also disaster happens, so they need it also fast. And this is a project called Micronation Macronation. This is actually an installation that presents a sustainable design prototype, and it contains installation of fermentation distillation machine that change hay into bioethanol. And there's also satellite data grabber, so we also grab a satellite, we hack the satellite, and then we use a supercomputer to process the data, and we pass the data into farmers so they know the best time to harvest and the best time to plant, and they can use also for another purpose. This is another work called IBSC, the Song of the River. This is actually a long research of the river in Indonesia, a contaminated river. And in here we also collaborate with high students in new museum that time to make a DIY water purification. And then we can see actually directly how actually the water, the effect of the water to the plants, and then you can see visually and you can hear directly. And this is maybe Radha, you will explain.
This is another project, another collaboration project. It's called Grow Kitchen. It's a simulation of 5 Kingdom of Life. We work with Dogs Lab. They are a digital architecture lab, and we work with Exact Lab. It's all female collective in Jogja, focusing in art, science, and free technology. Before we do this installation, we work in several workshops, and this is the last presentation of the workshop series we held in, and this is part of our process in our workshop. And this is Soya Culture. This is the project we collaborate with XX Lab. It's what I already told you about female collective, focusing in art, science, and free technology. This is this is a liquid waste from soya production process. And this is we want to make something useful like a biofuel, foodstuff, and leather-like textile. This project is to minimize water pollution, to introduce methods that are simple, cheap, and sustainable. And in the other hand, in the future, can contribute to a new circular economy.
There's actually a video.
And this is process that we share to public about.
Ini kedelai. Apa yang kamu ketahui tentang kedelai? Tempe, kecap, tahu, susu kedelai. Ada banyak sekali produk makanan yang terbuat dari kedelai di Indonesia. Tapi tahukah kamu, kalau kedelai juga bisa diolah menjadi material sandang dan kerajinan tangan? Seperti ini. Bagaimana caranya? Kita tanya XX Lab. XX Lab adalah Ira, Eka, Asa, Ratna, dan Kiki. Pada tahun 2013 di Yogyakarta, mereka ikut serta dalam workshop elektronika dasar oleh Stefani Musit yang diberi judul Miss Baltazar. Selepas workshop, mereka kemudian membentuk sebuah kolektif baru bernama XX Lab. XX dari kromosom perempuan. XX Lab menjadi wadah kolektif bagi para perempuan dari beragam latar belakang dan disiplin ilmu untuk mengeksplorasi seni, sains, dan teknologi. Di mana salah satu proyek yang mereka kerjakan adalah soya kulkas yang mengolah limbah tahu menjadi material sandang dan kerajinan tangan. Bahan yang diperlukan adalah limbah tahu, cuka, gula, urea, dan starter bakteri. Kita ambil limbah tahunya, rebus hingga mendidih bersama cuka, gula, dan urea. Setelah itu, pindahkan ke baki dan tunggu hingga dingin. Setelah dingin, kita masukkan starter bakteri yang kita buat sendiri dari air kelapa yang sudah tua. Tutup rapat baki dengan kertas dan simpan di tempat yang tidak terkena cahaya langsung. Bakteri akan membentuk lembaran nata de soya atau mikrobial selulose. Selanjutnya, lembar nata kita pres agar airnya keluar. Dan begini hasilnya. Sekarang, nata kita keringkan untuk diproses lebih lanjut dengan pewarna alam serta dilapis dengan lilin lebah agar menjadi lebih kuat. Lembar nata yang sudah diwarna dan dilapis lilin bisa kita manfaatkan sebagai material sandang dan kerajinan tangan seperti ini. Pengolahan limbah kedelai menjadi penting karena Indonesia adalah konsumen kedelai terbesar di dunia. Bayangkan berapa banyak limbah yang mengotori perairan dan merusak ekosistem jika hal itu dibiarkan begitu saja. Sementara jika diolah, limbah bisa memiliki nilai ekonomi dan mempunyai potensi pengembangan yang lebih luas. Dengan prinsip do it yourself, do it with other, serta keyakinan bahwa pengetahuan harus dapat dibagikan dengan bebas, XX Lab berharap akan lebih banyak lagi pihak yang tertarik untuk mengolah limbah kedelai.
So that is Access Lab, one of our collective at HONF, and we also have an international summit festival every year called Transform Making. And this is the picture of Transform-Making Festival. And yeah, we make this presentation in memoriam of one of our founders, Tommy Surya, that just passed away 1 week ago. Thank you so much. So I will pass.
So now I'd like to introduce Samuel Cohen Cosino, who is here on behalf of IsumaTV. Sam is the distribution manager for IsumaTV, and IsumaTV was born out of the 20-year collective practice and was launched in 2008. It's a multimedia platform for indigenous filmmakers and media organizations to create and distribute their work, and it's based in Igloolik, Nunavut northern Canada, and as I was saying, began in 1987.
Thanks. I want to start this presentation by reading a short text by one of our co-founders, Zacharias Kunuk, and then from there I'll go into my presentation. People in Igloolik learned through storytelling who we were and where we came from for 4,000 years without a written language. Then foreign missionaries preached Paul's epistles to my parents in Inuktitut, saying, "Turn away from your old way of life." 4,000 years of oral history silenced by 50 years of priests, schools, and cable TV. This death of history is happening in my lifetime. How are shamans tied? Where do suicides go? What will I answer when I'm an elder and I don't know anything about it? Will I have anything to say? Lately, I want to write to the bishop and say, "Let my people go." In the 1970s, Igloolik voted twice against TV from the south since there was nothing in Inuktitut, nothing in it for us. But I noticed when my father and his friends came back from hunting, they would always sit down with tea and tell the story of their hunt. And I thought it would be great to film hunting trips so you wouldn't have to tell it, just show it. In 1981, I sold some carvings and bought a video camera. When I watched my videos, I noticed kids gathered outside my window looking in to see the TV. That was how special it was at the beginning. Can Inuit bring storytelling into the new millennium? Can we listen to our elders before they all pass away? Can we save our youth from killing themselves at 10 times the national rate? Can producing TV in Igloolik make our community, region, and country stronger? Is there room in Canadian filmmaking for our way of seeing ourselves? To try to answer these questions, we want to show how our ancestors survived by the strength of their community and their wits, and how new ways of storytelling today can help our community survive another 1,000 years. Our name Isuma means to think, as in thinking productions. Young and old work together to keep our ancestors' knowledge alive. We create traditional artifacts, digital multimedia, and desperately needed jobs in the same activity. Our productions give an artist's view for all to see where we came from, what Inuit were able to do then and what we are able to do now. So, just for some brief context, this is Igloolik Nunavut, and the photo here on the right is the Igloolik region, with all the Inuktitut text is different place names where people used to go and used to live before the community was formed in the early 20th century. Inuit have been living in the Igloolik region for over 4,000 years. So this is a photo of the first Isuma production in 1987, and Isuma was incorporated in 1990 as Canada's first Inuit independent production company. The goal of Isuma was to produce Inuktitut content made by Inuit for Inuit. Since then, Isuma and its related Igloolik video partners, Arneit Video Production, which is a women's film collective, and Artsic, which is a youth circus performance collective, as well as they've also produced videos and films, have produced over 45 works of short fiction, documentary, and feature films, and have won awards around the globe. Starting mainly with short fiction and also historical recreation fiction, mainly based in the first films were based mainly in the 1940s in the Igloolik region. And our feature films would screen in theaters and festivals around the world, but Inuit living in remote communities, which were our primary audience, were often the last to see them. So we dreamed of a new distribution system that would allow Inuit audiences more access to our content, whether they live in remote communities or wherever they are around the world. Especially like with the words of Zach, as you can see, the main the Isuma's vision was really to create to sort of recreate cultural knowledge and pass on cultural and traditional knowledge that has been lost, and to do it within the community and to create community empowerment that way and to create cultural production, as well as all the other benefits that can come from making your own films and making your own content. So in 2006, we asked ourselves, what would an open indigenous media space look like? How could we create a website that would be accessible to our primary audience, but also to people around the world, including other indigenous groups who might be dealing with very similar issues to ours, but in their own way and with their own knowledge and their own traditions and their own language. So we came up with IsumaTV, so Thinking TV, which was originally Inuit focused and yet is a completely global platform that launched in 2008. So this is the original page. And you can see here it says there's a low speed option and a high speed option because there is such a divide in internet access in northern Canada that we needed to create a low speed version of the website, and all of our films would be accessible in both these formats. And this 2008, I mean, YouTube was a thing, but there was very few online spaces where you could see long form films, and so and stream long form films. Netflix was still just sending films by mail, so it was a long process of coming up with this kind of technology and how do we make it as open and accessible as possible. IsumaTV doesn't take ownership over any content that is uploaded on the website, and we don't have any ads, and the website is completely free. That's part of our philosophy, is create a radically open space that is available to anyone to use within their own for their own goals and their own needs. So at the moment, we have over 6,000 films and videos that are in 80 different languages, many of them, the majority of them, indigenous languages. Most of the films come from, a lot of the films come from the north, from northern Canada, but we have a lot of collections from South America as well, and Central America, and some from other parts of the world as well. And then, in conjunction with the website, we realized that even the low bandwidth version of our website still did not play in northern communities. And as you can see, there's an incredible difference in internet speed between urban centers in Canada and the north. And so in order to bridge that gap, we created this IsumaTV media player, which is a local server system that connects to our website, and then from there acts as a server that can play directly into people's homes through connecting by cable television. Every community in Nunavut has a local public cable channel. That was part of the agreement in bringing cable into these communities in the late 70s, early 80s. And a lot of those channels are kind of empty, or there's like ads that are just running on them, local ads. So we can use that infrastructure and plug our media player into that. And therefore any footage, any video that is uploaded on the website will then play in high speed without extra bandwidth costs in everyone's televisions in their homes, which also creates a sort of a different conception of what media production can be, because anybody can then, create a television show and show it on in the community. And the server syncs up every couple of days, and so new content adapts. When we originally send them up to communities, they're loaded with everything that's on the website, and then they slowly they slowly sync up. The local server also is able to connect to a Wi-Fi access. So you could put a server in a community center and then use that as sort of a cultural hub for film production and all kinds of other services that the internet can provide and that video can provide. As well as local film production. Not all communities we don't send that equipment necessarily up to every community. It depends on what the community wants. But we do also have that option, as well as local radio that we can broadcast online as well, also through the website, and local theater projections as well. So I don't really want to spend too much time on this because I don't really understand the specifics of the programming behind this, but that's the general idea, is that you would have each community has their local uploads in their local channel, and then that can connect to the World Wide Web, connect to our website that has a global platform, and then also then goes back into each community. So you can effectively create a network between communities that are separated by long distances. And you can create, each community could have their own channel, and then as well as create sort of a larger program, a larger connection between groups. So this is briefly what a community page looks. Every community that has a media player has a community page. Obviously anyone can create a page on the Isuma website, but this is a specific community page, and so the community hub would be where all the videos are uploaded, and then television would be the local television channel that's connected to cable, which can be programmed by someone in the community, creating playlists that loop, and they can be modified. And then the radio also is an option for certain communities, and we've used radio before to create certain for specific projects, specifically towards mining and consultation. And this is an example of what the Iglulik community page looks, one of many pages of uploaded content. As you can see, there's a lot of different things. There's stuff about community mining hearings, as well as animated films and interviews and information about, videos about how to skin seal and other content like that that's uploaded on the site. So one thing that, as I spoke briefly about community, how much time? Okay, I don't want to take too much time, but one thing I did want to speak about specifically is our relationship with how our website can be used for consulting on mining projects. And we worked on a project with Carleton University in Ottawa to create a network between communities affected by new mining projects in Nunavut. And through broadcasting everything online, broadcasting radio online, all in Inuktitut, trying to translate this very complex legal language and the language of the mining company, and trying to make that more accessible to Inuit, as well as allowing for Inuit to create a network where they can communicate with each other and monitor themselves what is going on around the mine and after the mine, that's separate from government agencies, and that's really rooted in the community. So I think I'll just end it there.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce Nare Magotu and Malemo Mwila, who constitute MadeYouLook. They are a Johannesburg-based collective, and they've been working on different projects that think about the ordinary practices and everyday occurrences that become the basis for our understanding social issues more broadly.
Cool, thank you. To start off, thank you to the Vera List Center for Art and Politics for having us here, but I think also just in general for having this award, which we think is really valuable. And we're going to do something slightly different, where we're going to speak about one specific project which we think kind of represents a lot of what we do anyway. As was mentioned, we're MadeYouLook. We've based in Johannesburg and been working together since 2009. And generally our work kind of explores the idea of working from very local, very everyday practice and developing new ideas, knowledge production, kind of questioning where knowledge originates and finds its power from these very ordinary everyday practices. We're interested in the sort of ideas around questioning the university as a space of knowledge production, working with ideas of DIY, play with ideas of kind of public and interactive practices, as well as engaging kind of ideas of our history and the archive and where we come from, and kind of trying to think about new imaginaries for the future from that.
Cool. So we're going to speak very specifically about this project, corner loving. And corner loving is a term that we have had to sort of invent for ourselves to speak about the practice of black working class couples, heterosexual couples, having to meet in public on street corners to kind of afford themselves a moment of privacy. So when we first sort of encountered corner loving, we were interested for ourselves to kind of understand why people would go into the public space in order to afford themselves some privacy. And some of the factors we started to find sort of varied. Some of them were sort of financial constraints around not having enough money to go like on a conventional date, for example. Other reasons were around overcrowded accommodation, where you had to go into like the private in order to like into the public in order to find the private. Also things around conservative parents who think that their children are too young for love. So these are some of the things that we discovered as we were conceiving of this.
This gives kind of an example of how you can take a very ordinary practice that everybody sort of sees in their peripheral vision all the time, and then unpack it to kind of understand our sort of local set of issues and kind of our context in general. So to bring this back to this panel and sort of the idea of thinking about language, we actually had been thinking about corner loving for about 4 years before we actually started to work on a project on it. And the reason it had taken us so long to get to that point was because we were really concerned about language and what are the kinds of visualities that would be possible to explore this thematic. Reason being that something like photographs of corner loving would inevitably be voyeuristic, would be imposing on a practice for an audience that doesn't really belong there. And how do we find a language that kind of explores this for us, that kind of asks these questions without creating this kind of problematic dynamic of audience to subject? And also that we didn't really have images of what we've now come to call black love to rely on, that there isn't really a kind of a canon or a set of images of black love, of black loving, that we can use to kind of serve as a shorthand or a set of references in order to develop this project. And so effectively what we started to do was initially we developed a set of drawings, sort of removing the subjects from the idea but actually trying to explore the things that corner loving potentially deals with. We did a set of sort of pseudo-scientific ethnographic research processes where we sat on a corner and we thought about issues of lighting. Johannesburg's a really dangerous city. So if you're going to be chilling on a corner at night, you have to have just enough light for it to be safe, but let it be slightly dark enough for privacy, or just enough people walking past for it to be safe, but not so many people that you can't have your moment whispering to the ear of your lover or whatever. But also developing a set of kind of other kinds of statistics around which corners and which places, mostly in the inner city and in the township and that kind of thing. But in the longer term, we found that these drawings didn't really do exactly what we wanted.
So then we started thinking about other media that could possibly supplement the nuances of the practice that the drawings didn't capture. So the drawings obviously are about space very predominantly. And so one of the other media that we started to think about was the format of lectures. And so we approached several South African academics who had been thinking around similar ideas of black love and how to start representing narratives that are perhaps a bit more fragile within the South African context, where usually we discuss like the very big kind of narratives around the trauma of apartheid, for example. And so that space became a space where we in some ways formalized the practice of corner loving as constituting knowledge and worthy of considering as something worthy of like intellectual consideration. Yeah.
And that's a thematic that we've been interested in over time. I mentioned that we've been interested in sort of challenging the university as a space of knowledge production. We ran a project where we got university lecturers to try and give university level lectures on the metro rail, on the kind of ordinary train system. So it's kind of a thematic that we've been interested in working with over time. We're also quite interested in writing. So part of the project was also commissioning some texts, fictional texts, poetic texts, but also looking at archival texts of different forms, which I'll talk about a bit later, I think. But for example, this one is of two soldiers who would have been fighting in exile, writing to the African National Congress to ask permission to fall in love and to potentially get married. Okay, I think that generally why these letters were specifically interesting was because that they enabled a kind of connection to the tenderness and the softness and the kind of affective side of love in a way that the drawings in the lecture series talked so much more to kind of this kind of pseudoscientific strategy was to try and create this formalization of this knowledge production, and yet we felt like if Black love is this thing that hasn't been captured, that hasn't enabled a space for us to discuss and engage with it, we needed to really engage with the sort of tenderness side to that. So one of the letters, for example, is a letter from the 50s of a migrant worker writing to his lover in the most absolutely gentle, beautiful terms. But the really important part of this is that he would have been illiterate, and so somebody would have had to write the letter for him, and his lover would have been illiterate too, and so somebody would have had to read the letter for him, kind of reflecting back on the fact that Black love has so often had to be public in order to sort of continue and remain through the kind of political frameworks of migrant labor and other kind of political limitations.
And finally, we have been interested in questions of using tiered language in order to kind of speak to various audiences. We've also been very obsessed with a local photographer called Santo Mofokeng, who very often speaks about the violence being in the knowing, and therefore you don't have to have very hyper-visible examples of violence, for example, right? You can start to evoke things that people are very familiar with, right? And that is something that can be retooled for us, where instead of violence, we can say that the beauty is in the knowing, right? That audiences can come in, look at the drawings, and immediately be taken into corner loving as opposed to representing it.
Yeah, effectively, we're really interested in kind of people who come to our work, coming to it at, as Nari says, different levels, and that people who know this thing that isn't necessarily a kind of knowledge that is immediately available to all those to everybody, but people who know can read it at a very deep level, and anybody else can kind of engage it at the primary level. And we're really interested in not attempting to translate for everybody. We're really interested in creating a kind of opacity, a kind of set of things that if you really want to engage with this, you really have to do the work, and to understand that there are many people who may not engage in universities, may not engage in kind of highfalutin discourse, who know so much more and who can access at this much deeper level. And we're really keen on thinking about language in that sense. I think I'll leave it at that.
Great. That you're done.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd also now like to invite Whitney Slayton up as the respondent for this panel. Whitney is the assistant professor of music technology at Lang College here at the New School. He researches and teaches at the nexus of music technology, liveness, race, and labor, and he'll be offering some remarks.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Is this thing on? I mean, we had a joke at the dinner about live sound engineering, which is the area of my research. But before touching on that, I just want to say at Lang College, the liberal arts college of the New School, in the art department, and more specifically in the music, contemporary music program, we're currently in the moment of thinking about how best a liberal arts college should deal with the study of music technology. And I think it's very appropriate for me to have this kind of opportunity to respond to these panelists and these examples, because very much a lot of what you're doing is kind of the direction I feel that we should go in the context of our institution here. So in other words, we have a recording studio on the 8th floor of this building, and we, approach the analog practice of amplifying sounds, recording them, but with an effort to always connect to some sort of community impact, especially in the wake of the heightened recording industry, to think about all these emergent post-industrial expressions of recording processes, modes of listening, all these kinds of things. Sure. How ironic. So, how about this? This may be better. My own research that informs much of my pedagogy on these sorts of topics is based on ethnographic fieldwork that I've done in Harlem, in particular, actually throughout New York City, in which I study the labor practices of live sound engineers. These are the engineers who amplify musical sounds at concerts. One engineer was a Broadway engineer who amplified Porgy and Bess at the Richard Rodgers Theater. The other one was a freelance engineer working at rock concerts at various venues. And my own engineering at Jazzmobile, which is a not-for-profit, jazz, live jazz organization that puts on concerts throughout New York City and all 5 boroughs, but especially at Grant's Tomb, near 122nd Street and Riverside Drive. It was founded in 1964 by Dr. Billy Taylor with the sole purpose of, and this is a term that I want us to think through in the juxtaposition of all of these projects, my own included, which is repatriation. Dr. Billy Taylor had thought at this time, so much upheaval with the civil rights movement, so much unrest in urban locales throughout the country, that considering New York City and the live music, particularly the jazz music market, had been so downtown-centric or focused. And he was responding specifically to the fact that the cost to attend a professional jazz concert was prohibitive for the community from whence the genre had emerged, right? And so the idea was to take a parade float and, use it as a stage that would actually mobilize professional jazz concerts throughout Harlem so that people could gather in the context of block parties, city parks, to hear the same professional jazz performers who had been playing at the Blue Note, at the Birdland, or all of these clubs that still persist in their corporate iterations now. And so given that, Jazzmobile persists and it continues to offer these free outdoor concerts. My work as an ethnographer was very much intertwined with my work with Jazzmobile as the sound engineer for these performances. And so this is the particular point where I find a lot of resonance with all of these projects. So maybe before I go line by line, I did think of this idea of giving the genre back in certain ways, or giving these aesthetic expressions back to a community where we associate an origin in the rhetorics and the ideologies of certain genred practices and these sorts of things. I find to be a compelling linkage, in which we also have a DIY sort of instance, right? So it's not, let's take all of the entrapments of modern sound reproduction to bring them to these small, intimate neighborhood settings. Very much like we're talking about with this issue of the server, right? It's like, we can't put expensive line array loudspeakers as we have in like Madison Square Garden in front of Grant's Tomb. So it's a matter of fashioning comparatively modest equipment, to serve a giving back, an active mediatized repatriation of source material that has been amplified in very high modern contexts beyond that locality, back to the locality. I find to be very interesting. Also with the case of prosthetics, with I read in the abstract and I saw in the part of one of the video presentations, to make a leg $50 US, right? In this way of not necessarily a competition against these modern or late modern technological alternatives that are so much maybe more efficient or so forth, but in the ways that the processes of doing it yourself or for oneself has an impact on the definition of community itself. That if there's a sincere sort of subject to subject, as Jonathan Jackson writes about Harlem, sort of engagement with text and context, that there's something very compelling about that. And then I guess more directly to my own work, I find the points that you've brought up in MadeYouLook about finding private in the public in these contexts of DIY, to map on very intimately to what these experiences I had as an ethnographer in Harlem, which is that, not only is there this giving back, not only were we there as a community amplifying sounds in ways not only to an intensity but in qualities that often mimicked so-called professional productions of the genre, that this was somehow private yet public, because we're always outside, we were always in these large spaces, but there was still the construction and the maintenance of the construction of an intimacy when people do things together in this DIY spirit. In spite of the fact that there's an internet that mediates, or in spite of the fact that, we're dealing with, I think the first example was of, what was it, interplanetary, there was some truck. I'm trying to think of your first example.
Terrestrial something.
The extraterrestrial.
Yes.
Yeah, so in spite of the fact that these engagements have at their texts, the abilities to think about objects and so forth far beyond the immediate consumption, the fact that it's DIY, as the mode of production seems to produce solidarities and, again, intimacies and so forth. So I think I've probably done one of these things where I've gone down the list already, and so when I look down, I'm saying, oh, I think I said that. Oh, and then one thing from dinner, the dinner was very productive for me in meeting everyone, that we talked about in conjunction with MadeYouLook was the derogatory term of ethnography, right? So that oftentimes we're, especially in settings like this, taking on an ethnographic gaze at these practices. But yet when there's an artistic intervention, or when artistic practice becomes the mode through which we observe and interview and participate, I think the subject position associated with ethnography that's been so unethical in many instances starts to diffuse in ways that make the ethnography not for an abstracted institution, but an ethnography for the people themselves, right? So I think we're all in different ways exemplifying that. So those are just a couple of ideas that I wanted to put out there. But I thank you all again for your presentations. Really quite fruitful.
Thank you. Thank you, Whitney. That was really an incredibly helpful introduction to linking all of these practices together. I think the best way for us to proceed is to go through these three key points that we've been talking about as kind of undergirding the conversation that we're about to have. And those are scalability. So this question of care and maintenance that comes with scaling something from a local to a global context, and what are the different aspects of a practice that you need to take into account as you're doing that. And media specificity, so how media and the form and type of media that you're using plays a role in co-constituting the content of the work that you're producing. And also this question, I think probably the biggest one for everybody's practice is this question of recognition and accessibility. So how there's a sort of power established through unlocking a self-recognition in the eyes of others. So a self-recognition of one's own capacity to produce knowledge, and how that gets authorized through media and language. I think there's something in that links up with Whitney's presentation in this way of repatriating through media, so mediatized repatriation. And one of the projects that I thought was most compelling for that we've talked about previously is this Balapa.
Micronation.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's something that HONF has been telling us about, and I'm wondering if maybe we could start with you in this question of recognition and accessibility, and if you could explain that project a little bit.
Yeah, Micronation is actually started at 2010.
Yeah.
And it's actually a project about democratizing food and energy to in aim to get sustainability also in food and energy. And so the project itself, so we work with a lot of farmers in Yogyakarta, and then we using technology actually to give them also access for the information, and then to the technology itself, and then how they can actually explore it and then adapt it and then develop it. And then so first there is actually there are three most important components. First, the farming itself. So we built kind of like a prototype in three different areas in Yogyakarta, working with the local farmers. And then we also working with some scientists and activists. So we grab the data from the satellite Palapa. And it's actually hack it, not grab it. And then
And the satellite is a state-owned satellite.
Yes, it's a satellite. And then...
so maybe just to interject that state-owned satellite also creates a very expensive tiered access to all this information that farmers would need in order to successfully farm the land.
Yes.
And so that's a big part of the intervention, is creating access for people who would be able to produce their own food.
Yes, and energy.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So. Yeah. So, and then we also transform the data that can be more accessible for the farmer, and then. They can download it, and then we make it into apps, and then we make it also into we send it also into SMS, because nobody have not everybody have a smartphone, and then we make also that mobile lab that is also traveling around, so they can also grab the data that they want to have, and then we also make actually. Kind of like a lab that turn actually hay into bioethanol. So because usually they just burn the hay, so actually if they have the bioethanol and they have this prototype into reality, and then actually so our aim is actually to propose the government in Indonesia actually at 2020 actually they can have a sustainable in food and energy. But actually, there is no response.
There's no response, no.
And then you're also saying that project is something that was shared with communities in Sudan?
Yeah, it's actually there is a project called Open Source Sudan. And then we also working with some people there, and then an institution in Germany called Eroisi Media that we also give them also the blueprint, and then we communicate also with them that they can also adopt it in there.
So maybe we can keep passing this question on to you about recognition and accessibility. You were talking about how for indigenous communities that you're working with and involved with, that they will oftentimes have to go to the museum in order to be able to engage with the sort of historical and ancestral knowledge that they would normally have access to, that their communities have developed over the years. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that you and your collective have reproduced those materials as representations in films, and how that gives ownership to that knowledge through a sort of avatar.
Maybe I can use one example of a specific film, and how that cultural production occurred. In 2006, Zacharias Kunuk directed a film called The Journals of Knud Rasmussen, which is a film that was based on the life of the last shaman that lived in the Iglulik region in the 1920s. And for that film, there was a lot of research that was done into looking at old photos that were taken, as well as clothing, and how to sort of recreate some of those items that were taken out of the community in the early 20th century. The year previous to that, he had traveled with a couple of elders from IsumaTV to some museums in the United States and in Canada that contain a lot of Inuit art and Inuit clothing and beadwork and other artifacts that were taken and that remain in collections away from the access of the majority of Inuit folks. There's been a lot of talk of creating a museum, a cultural institute in Nunavut that would be able to hold these materials, but that hasn't happened yet. And so, for example, some of the work, some of the beadwork, for example, from people from the Igloolik region were then recreated for the film, and in a sense, like now are owned by the people in Igloolik. And so once that is in our control and also on film, it's then lives in a sense forever, especially if in a sense we control the product. So our company is majorly Inuit owned. We have non-Inuit people working for it, including me. But there's the ownership of the content all stays within our collective, and that's extremely important for us to keep control even outside of other government-run media organizations. We really take a lot of pride in keeping ownership of that in order to not sort of recreate another sort of form of colonial museum in a sense. So that kind of recreation is very important to us. It's very important to Zach. I mean, we work with artists as well who are very interested in talking about other topics and making contemporary films or films discussing, the future. But Zach's main concern is recreating the past on film in order to keep it forever in his mind. When we're all gone in hundreds of years, the content will still be there, and it'll be in Inuktitut, and it'll be a living archive that is under Inuit control. So that's kind of the dream and the philosophy. Mm-hmm.
And Naria Malemo, you in the Corner Loving project, you've been talking about developing language, both visual language and literal language, as it's written on the page, for understanding working class Black love and a sort of common recognition of that. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which that's becoming sort of how you're creating sort of symbols and icons through those different types of language.
I
was thinking specifically about the architectural drawings and some of the translations in the text.
Can you just go for it and I'll jump in?
Sure. So what we have done, both within the texts and within the notations in the drawings, is often refer to sort of popular terminologies and kind of words that people know, and kind of included them in these diagrams and in these texts, but chosen not to translate them, often chosen not even to italicize them. In many cases, because this project has shifted into many forms, we've also written quite a lot about it and published in different places and developed other forms of the content. Often we're asked to translate something or give a footnote or something like that, and we've sort of resisted having to do that because in many senses these words are not really translatable. But also that in some cases, for example, one of the drawings that we showed has the term kaparing in the notation, and it's actually a word Nari and I had never seen written down, and it's a word that kids kind of all use because it's kind of come with me to go get something or go to a place, and usually when you go love on a corner, you take someone with you, like your friend, because you're meeting a boy and you're shy and you need a little bit of backup or whatever. And we couldn't find this word written down anywhere, and yet it's a word that's used constantly. And so even trying to kind of articulate it onto the page, it was a kind of weird practice. And we kind of hope that an audience might come to it that knows this word and might recognize the kind of random phonetic spelling of it and recognize what it is.
also because the drawings are kind of the most obtuse of the media. They speak very particularly to like one audience, but within this thing of creating imagery and like a sort of archive where none existed before. It's true in one sense, but also when we start looking at the archival texts, that begins to historicize things like Black love in South Africa, right? So we're not having to create languages from scratch, and that's what the other media kind of start to do as well. So again, in the sort of lecture series, that it brings a kind of genealogy of languages of speaking about Black love as well.
That's really interesting in light of this question of scalability, I think, which we were talking about earlier, and how you would navigate moving from a local to global context, and how there is a sort of necessary trust and like intersubjective relationship in establishing and understanding through a lot of these more nuanced tiered meanings. And so I'm wondering, it doesn't have to be as structured with this Q&A as it has been so far. If there any of you would like to talk about this question of trust and translatability in scaling.
I'll jump in. I think I keep smiling at Amanda because she's asked us this question so many times, and it's a really difficult question, and I was trying to avoid it.
Better and better answers.
Because I think there is a real challenge with that sense of trust, and as I mentioned, this kind of 4-year process of trying to find a modality that best suits what we're trying to do is partly because we don't trust the audience, I think, and are very aware of our own kind of role in potentially undermining that trust. And so I think it's really difficult to think about who you're speaking to and trying to find a way to be accessible at multiple levels. We've talked a lot about, why, if art is kind of meaning making, why make art if you're not really trying to talk to anybody? And so it's quite difficult, I think, for us to answer. And our best answer has been this kind of tiered approach of trying to have some level of accessibility to anybody who's not from the same context, who might still find interest in some of the broader thematics, and then to sort of work down from there.
I think it's, in our specific context, the audience that we're answerable to is the Inuit audience, and if things are not done right in our films, we definitely hear about it, and so that's part of the importance of working from the ground up in a specific community. And part of it is also being aware that and representing the incredible diversity within the Inuit community and within different regions, different dialects, different ways of making clothes, different ways of hunting, different ways of the traditional Inuit tattoos, and so everything is extremely, extremely localized to a very specific extent. At the same time, we believe that this kind of knowledge is something that deserves to be shared on an international stage, and it's going into those larger spaces in a sense is a way for us to show that this knowledge we believe that this knowledge is essential knowledge to share with the entire world, that Inuit traditional knowledge is extremely modern, is extremely applicable to the 21st century and to all kinds of issues that we're facing on a global scale. So I think that that's sort of part of the dynamic that we're trying to balance, is how do you show that while at the same time not diluting the content. And I think that the way we do it is really just showing the work, and the work speaks for itself. And if people don't understand it, that's on them to figure it out, and that's on them to do their work afterwards. We're not going to spell anything out because, again, the primary audience is an audience that will that will either know the context behind some of this knowledge, and other people are there to decolonize themselves, and if they feel uncomfortable, then that's good. So yeah, I think that's part of what we're trying to do.
Maybe just to draw you out on that a little bit more, you had talked previously about the kind of erratic levels of translation of these Inuit films from Inuktitut into English or other languages, and that oftentimes when there are screenings in more urban centers, the urban Inuit people will go to the cinema and be the dynamic is kind of flipped, where people for whom French or English is their primary language don't have any idea what's happening in the film, and everybody who's there will either have the only point of access, or there'll be also like tiered and nuanced levels of language that the Inuit community would recognize and that the English French speakers would be left out of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like it's based out of lived experience, and I mean, there's so much content also. I mean, there's a lot of people from the South that are really fascinated by Inuit culture and indigenous cultures in general, and in Canada, we're seeing a lot of films being produced by people who are non-indigenous, who do not have connection to the community in any sense, or that come and try and like do everything really quickly, and that creates a lot of errors, and there's a lot of ethical issues there. So in our work, we try and sort of flip that by showing these films in spaces where you do get those different types of audiences, and what brings us the most joy is when we have a film where like we don't translate everything, because like you said, translation, there's always going to be a dilution in the translation and dilution of meaning. So we'll have a film where certain things are just not translated, or the sense of humor is different or whatever. And if you're in an environment where there's a lot of indigenous people or a lot of Inuit in the audience who are laughing and you don't understand what's going on, we often get people who make comments afterwards like, it was the first time I was in a theater where I felt like I was I felt like I didn't understand what was going on. And I think that's like really important for people to figure out, for people to experience. So that's part of why we're doing it. But more than that, it's fun. Like, it's fun to show this content to Inuit audiences. I mean, that's what brings us the most joy. Or just people who have lived in the North for a long time and understand what's going on. And so, especially in urban communities, that's always something that we really focus on, is trying to create that sense of community for people who might be away from home. Or, I mean, it's almost $5,000 to fly from Montreal to Igloolik, which is a 5-hour flight. When often people get kind of, it's very difficult for people to go back home. And so doing that kind of outreach is a way of solidifying that community as well.
Would you like to speak to this question? I don't know if you were talking earlier about, or we were talking earlier about the sort of shared affinities that come in the international context and the collaborations.
Yeah, in our case that we use science and technology to elaborate everything, because we're not just only working with scientists, actually, that we always working with a mother in a rural area, and then sometimes we work with a farmer, very diverse. So we use this science and technology to like a medium to create and to making to produce the knowledge itself, I think.
And I think we also open the knowledge, because we also have a base as everything that we do have to be like open and accessible, and we also use open source like software, hardware, and for almost every work that we have. So we also like share the knowledge and open it, and then at the same time it's also actually we open a participatory from the people. So actually it's developed the work more and more, like locally or globally actually.
Yeah, it was very strong to hear what you were saying about people knowing that they know, and the democratization of knowledge that you're working to produce.
Yeah, so we actually democratizing like everything that we have that we produce actually, so people actually can adapt it, or people can develop it, or other people can also change it if they want. So for us, it's actually democratizing the knowledge, is give it to everybody, and then I think because we give it and then they give it back also back to us, and then that's why actually the works or every project that we work is always on the development.
So maybe we can open the conversation up to questions from the audience if anybody has anything that they would like to ask the panelists. I think there's one over here.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for all your stuff. The two people from MadeYouLook, I was just thinking what you're saying reminded me that I once went to a poetry reading where the poet said in a talk afterwards that sometimes he wishes that he could only read his poetry to one or two people, like that it's a public reading, but that he can select his audience and only one or two or three people because he doesn't want to be misunderstood or something along those lines. That what you two were saying about your audience kind of reminded me of that. And I just want to ask one other thing out of my ignorance is what you were talking about like love on the street corners. Is that like mostly teenagers or people of all ages?
It's
Thanks.
people of all ages. So corner loving can sort of signify different things, right? So if you're a man in your 40s and you are meeting your love on the street corner for like this private moment, it might say that it's too soon to take that person back to like your apartment, for instance. Also, it might again point to financial constraints, right? So like there's a lot of overcrowding in the inner city of Johannesburg. So you might not want to go have...
You mean overcrowding of apartments?
Sorry, in apartments. So you might not want to have that moment with other people around. So it's all levels, teenagers all the way up.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think at one level it's also a little bit silly to be so protective of the content. I mean, we were talking to Amanda about also a kind of problematic feeling like gatekeepers, particularly if your interest is in this kind of knowledge production. I think there's kind of a maybe slightly strange assumption that that's your role, which I think is a complex part of some of these things.
And you had also talked about corner loving, sidestepping kind of sexual love and being more about romantic love. And I also really appreciate what you're saying in terms of changing affect into being more about tenderness. Could you say a little bit about how you're thinking of tenderness in relationship to language?
So as part of the lecture series, one of the failings we kind of saw was in the ways that people spoke about love. So, and I suppose that was part of the exercise with the lecture series, right? Is that very often was very over like intellectualized. The language that people were using wasn't ndofondofo, wasn't like soft, and that was in that exercise we found that, and we had to, even in our writing, we've had to kind of use very particular language that might perhaps capture affect and the sort of intonations that we want to speak in more effectively.
This is more maybe of a granular curiosity, but these questions of public and private that you've been bringing up, and we were talking, there was a great moment yesterday about cracking into invisibility. Could you talk a little bit more about the lectures on the public transit that you were talking about? And I think it also dovetails nicely with that comment about audience, you know, how that functioned practically, what it felt like, levels of success or not, or how you thought about that.
Should I answer it straight away?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. The project was called Sermon on the Train, and it was playing with the fact that, I mean, all over the world, but very much in South Africa, we have these church trains, so people who get on the train and preach. I think a little bit unlike where they happen in other world, you have a whole train car that is a church. So, I mean, it's not as if someone just comes on and preaches and gets off. Like, all the people in that car know all the songs and sing along, and it's like quite an intense sort of church space. And so we were playing with that in terms of trying to have university lecturers on the trains. And so we approached a number of lecturers, many of whom said no, and asked them to speak on the trains and to give university level lectures. Also important is that the Metro Rail in South Africa is historically a really dangerous, quite violent space. In the early 90s, during major political unrest, it was lots of people were pushed off trains and killed on trains, and that's kind of a kind of continued sort of imagination of the trains, and many working class people won't take them. Only the people who absolutely have no other kind of public transport choice take them. And then these trains are also really important because of the very long distances people travel, because we're still sort of subject to apartheid spatial separations. So the lectures, part of the idea was to challenge the university around what it means to have a public lecture and what it means to have knowledge that's valuable and relevant to the rest of the world. And so was it sort of challenge to lecturers to give a university level lecture, not to dumb it down, but to therefore test themselves as to what it really meant to be there.
In terms of successes and failings, I think as we went along, it got better. So the third person we had began to realize that actually this isn't perhaps a space for her to cling on to her notes, and then began to adapt her discussion to her audience, but never dumbing it down. Whereas everyone else, even with the sort of interruptions of people selling stuff on the train, people coming and going, stuck very rigidly to that. And so I think that was perhaps a better strategy, like on her part, and sort of challenging her sort of notions around what it means to kind of impart knowledge.
And audiences did ask questions, and so there was actually an engagement with the lectures, but in the end we stopped it because it wasn't really, I mean, I think it was a valuable challenge to the university, and in fact the university then started sort of getting us to do them for the university as part of a kind of
weird PR exercise.
And this was just before the big decolonize the university sort of moment that came into the universities as well. And so we just felt like it wasn't really doing what we wanted to be doing, and it ended up being a kind of weird project, so we just stopped.
Just a really simple question. When you've all shown diagrams to describe what you do or how you may reach people, and then
MadeYouLook.
Yeah. You kind of critique that, about how you prefer to show something more intimate than a diagram. And I want your comments on that, but I would suggest that a diagram is a coping strategy also, and maybe just needs to be materialized some other way. It was quite poignant for me to see the diagram, and yet you're all speaking to very intimate, situations. And so I just wanted your further thoughts, all three, on using it as a tool, as a coping strategy, perhaps, or some other reason.
Maybe Irene and Ratna, maybe if you could begin addressing that question of why a diagram is a useful tool for you. I think there is a very teleological impulse in your practice, that you're very clear on what the end goals are for each of these projects. And it seems like something like a schematic or a diagram really lends itself to that.
I think because our background is like very diverse, so we need it like really specific and not to control, I think to make it clear to everybody like what we do, and then it's also for everybody that at HONF actually what our goal and what is what we want to explain for the people, and it's also for the people to understand about the practices that we did.
In our context, I think that the diagrams, which were made by Gabriela Gomez, who is the manager of the media player server system, as well as the website, is sort of a way of kind of simplify, because it's a challenge for us to kind of to explain the technology, or to not get, it's always what makes like presentations like this so difficult for me, is that like how do you discuss the technology without getting like bogged down in the concept of the technology and how it works, and at the same time, like, especially when we're working in, from great distances with other people and people in remote communities, how do you pass that knowledge on? How do you troubleshoot? And how do you also like not make it seem like too scary or intimidating? Is something that's like a big challenge. And also, how do we kind of balance the discussion between like infrastructural access, but then also still focusing on media production and the cultural importance of media production and the beauty that comes with that, and the very intimate, personalized experiences that people have either working on these films or making films or watching films. And so it's a challenge for sure to find a way to communicate both these things equally. And so I think the diagrams kind of help with that, but in terms of like getting into the specifics of how the technology works, it's really hard to explain that.
It's interesting. Sorry, just to expand on this for a moment, it's interesting what you were saying about the necessity to write it down, because you're also talking about how Inuktitut has only been a written language since the 1920s, and that's such a huge shift in how the culture is reproduced and passed down. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that intergenerational translation of knowledge is changing because of these kinds of records.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that has been sort of central to the website has been to try and conceptualize what an oral language space on the web would look like, and how do we do that? And I don't know if I don't think we figured it out. I mean, our website tries to be as visual as possible with as limited text as possible, and the content itself is sort of influenced by that form of teaching, which is teaching by showing and teaching by in a sense not being didactic and just watching and listening and trying to figure it out that way. And so knowledge being passed like that, in a sense, is more true to older forms of Inuit knowledge that have been passed. I mean, there's stories that are thousands and thousands of years old and span thousands of kilometers, and everyone knows the same story, and that's incredible. So how do you replicate that in the 21st century? I don't know. That's sort of one of our main goals and lifetime work.
And it's interesting that you're engaging it through this form of knowledge that is kind of a colonial form of knowledge, and trying to find ways to intervene with that. You were talking earlier in an earlier conversation this morning about how how Inuit communities in the Northern Territories in Canada were resistant to having cable television because it was seen as another mechanism or tool of assimilation and therefore language loss. So now to find ways to engage and start subverting these networks, I think is really interesting. I don't know if there's anything more that you would add to that about the way that Izuma is thinking about that engagement.
Well, one thing that we're trying to do is promote this kind of model in other communities in Canada who are struggling with issues of language loss. Inuktitut is, compared to a lot of other Canadian Indigenous languages, fairly healthy, but there's still a lot of work to be done to improve it and to make to improve the education system and make it more based in Inuktitut. Right now we're working with a community in northern BC where there's only 20 people who fluently speak their language, the Haida people. And we've been working with a production company there to make a film all in the Haida language. And so that film is going to be released next year. And part of the production of the film is relearning the language, learning your lines, and then how do you use the money also from the film in order to create a stronger infrastructure, and how to put that on the World Web as well, because people obviously in Haida Gwaii have been working on saving language for generations, but how do we then assist with new technology to make it maybe more accessible to folks, and to make it to have a sort of permanent space that can grow and that can modify itself as new people learn and new concepts evolve. So.
And on just a very pragmatic level, if people here wanted to know about how to see that film, how would they locate that through the Izuma platform?
If you go to isuma.tv, you'll find a lot of information about some of these different projects. The name of this Haida film is called Edge of the Knife, and there's a Facebook page, Edge of the Knife, and we also have a Facebook page, IsumaTV, where we are quite active and share a lot of information either about things that we're doing and our larger group are doing, and just general information about stuff happening mainly within the Canadian Indigenous context. So that would be the best place to find more information.
Mm-hmm. And Naria Malema, I don't know if you would like to speak to this question at all.
I just quickly wanted to address the question around diagrams. So there's two answers to this. The first is that not using photography was not only about sidestepping voyeurism, but it was also about not making the corners specific, right? Because then it becomes like portraits of the levers and of the corners, right? And we wanted to speak more generally of the practice, which is very widespread in Johannesburg and black townships. And the second thing is this was a kind of strategy of subtlety, because we come from a space where our aesthetics are kind of quite spectacular, right? And in spectacle, we don't see any of us. It's not for us. It's for like a different audience altogether. And so we wanted to work more subtly for an audience that would be very familiar with the things that we were speaking about, and would be immediately placed in the work.
Are there more questions? So one thing that I think keeps on coming up in the way that this conversation is moving is a question of vulnerability, and vulnerability of practices and also information and how it may be used. And I think that's part of the way that all of these different points link up with one another, is how does this information, as it's scaling up and being translated across different languages, continue to be used in ways that hold open space for making knowledge differently. That's something that I see HONF's practice doing really well, is continuing to hold up in these spaces and insisting that we all have the capacity for producing knowledge and producing the materials that we need to live, and in persisting and enduring ourselves. And it would be helpful to maybe talk through a couple examples of that. It was wonderful to see the video, but I don't know if there are ones in particular that, in your experience in working with HONF, if you could expand on a little bit.
Yeah, we one of our project is soya culture that we already mentioned. It's very organic because we work with so many people. We work with scientists, we work with artists, we work with designer, we work with an architect, we work with we learn from the mother from a rural area, and from that from a different background and discipline. That's why I think we produce how it can be added by each discipline to produce the knowledge, I think. So
there is another project called IBSC. It's called Intelligent Bacteria Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and it's actually a very simple process how to make an alcohol. But we come from Muslim country where it's actually alcohol is forbidden by law. But when we see actually the history, almost every district in Indonesia they produce alcohol, and then at that time actually thousands of people die because some people a lot of people produce alcohol not in the safe way, but they produce very underground, and they sell it, but it's not very safe. And then we work with one university actually, a very simple way how to produce a wine actually from local fruits. And actually we can present it, or we can make any workshop, so we present it actually into art. And because every fruits actually make different bubbles. When we have several fruits, so we call it bacteria orchestra because it makes a different kind of sound. So that's actually how we transfer the knowledge to the people. And then I think it's more natural way we present it into a works. And we also have several workshops like and with the university. So at the same time, it's actually we spread the knowledge, and at the same time, actually we also see the history of the truth, what's happening in Indonesia, and at the same time we actually save a life of the people.
And yeah, and after the project, until now, in our cities in Yogyakarta, a lot of people and young people who produce wine by themselves, like DIY wine and DIY alcohol.
And become souvenirs right now.
Yeah.
That's really helpful in hearing also about how you sort of learn from the materials that you're working with. Are there ways that idea of sort of learning from the materiality or learning from the form that you're working with informs either IsumaTV or MadeYouLook? The form being like language or film, and just structurally how it informs the practice?
I mean, I couldn't, since I'm not as closely involved with the act of production, and I'm more working on distribution of content. I mean, involved in some form of production, but I don't feel I could speak to it fully to a great extent. But I mean, for example, MadeYouLook is a community of just under 2,000 people, and so if we have a $2 million budget for a feature film that's set set in the early 20th century, let's say, or set in the past, then, it's the whole production of the film is sort of based around the philosophy of sort of working together for a common purpose, and so everyone has their own skill that they can contribute. So whether it's elders working on guiding younger people on how to do this or how to do that, how to make an igloo, how to sew this thing, or guides who go out and hunt for food while everyone's camping out on the land making the movie. Or actors, editors, people who are interested in doing sound production, like, people who want to translate or want to learn how to translate things from Inuktitut into English for subtitles. Like, there's always a sort of a learning process in every level, and it's as someone who's grown up in that environment, I can attest to how. You're always welcome to tag along as long as you're being useful in some kind of way. And so that's sort of part of the philosophy. And so there's a very sort of intimate learning component in any form of action, because it's all interlinked. It's not divorced from the rest, and it's very non-hierarchical, and that's very different from the experiences that I've had being on sets of other films, I think, and I think that shows in the final work. The process really informs what the final product looks like.
Yeah, I think we quite enjoy thinking through the complexities of trying to find form where form doesn't necessarily exist for a language. And I think maybe connected to what Sam was saying, we have a project called the Non-Monuments Project, which we started in 2012, which, like here, we have monument problems. And we had been thinking about the fact that we have all these really colonial and apartheid monuments around us, these kind of large physical structures that kind of constantly remind you of a certain kind of history, but that our own history is an oral history. And how do you monumentalize oralness? And so trying to think about a form that kind of responds to the fact that of this formless history and this value in a formlessness, and a society that has a value in sort of 6 meter high giant sculptures, as opposed to kind of these in-between spaces and these kind of spaces that stop and start and aren't necessarily material. And so we developed the Non-Monuments Project. There have been multiple iterations, but effectively we build 6 meter high cardboard sculptures, giant monuments. But actually the monument is within it, which is oral histories that play from within the monument, and that those oral histories are also often sort of contradictory or sometimes slightly fictional, which of course is the case with our histories, and that these monuments completely flatten that fact.
That's really helpful in thinking about the ways that all of your practices kind of de-technify or remove the expertise or the state-based validation of knowledge and practices. It's something that I'm realizing as we're all talking through these projects. And it's a way that I see you all finding value in the in-between spaces and kind of expanding that by taking up space and producing more knowledge in those interstices. And we were talking earlier about the sort of future work that you anticipate doing, and I think it might be helpful to hear about how you see these projects moving into the future, what you're planning to do moving ahead.
So we've had multiple iterations of corner living. The first manifestation was an exhibition, and then we've had journal entries and book chapters. And right now we are thinking of two things. The first is a self-initiated residency in the Eastern Cape, where there is the first examples of written language in South Africa, and letter writing was quite popular. And so we are going to go down to a museum down there and kind of work through their archives, through the letter writing, and then perhaps insert ourselves into their collection. And we're very excited about another project of ours where we are writing a children's book at the moment around Black love. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also Nari mentioned that we're major groupies for a South African artist, Santu Mofokeng. And so we're increasingly also thinking about the fact that a lot of the work of artists, or certain artists are really, really popular in South Africa and have sort of global recognition, but there are a number who may have that, but it's not necessarily accessible to people who would be super interested. So we're increasingly thinking about ways of working with existing artistic practices or writing practices in the case of Santu Mofokeng, and thinking about how these might become more accessible to more people. So I think that's another sort of phase we're looking into.
What are are there some ways of thinking about access that you're...
Not that we can say, no.
Okay.
Yeah, it wouldn't be... Yeah, we shouldn't say.
On our end, there's a couple things that we're working on. Well, there's the Haida film, which we're super excited about, as well as a kids film from the Arnade Video Collective that is also gonna come out at some point in 2018, and then we're also just generally very excited about creating new partnerships with other indigenous producers. We're in the process of becoming an eligible distributor within the Canadian film funding system, and the goal with that is to be able to work with more producers and be able to promote access to funding for indigenous language feature films. As well, we're also working on a retrospective of our 30 years of work and trying to get into certain gallery spaces. We have an exhibit coming up outside of Toronto that's going to be focused on one of the first feature film that our collective made, Atanaltrot, and it's going to sort of within the lens of indigenous resurgence and film production as act of resurgence. So yeah, that's some of the things that are coming up, and there's some other big projects as well that we can't announce, but that'll be coming up soon, so follow us on Facebook.
Could you say a little bit more actually about this engagement with gallery spaces? I think that's something new for Izuma.
Yeah, I mean, we have some of our video work and film work has been shown in a lot of gallery spaces before, but we're sort of interested in curating our own shows and to bring sort of our own kind of spin on things. So for the past year, we've been working with an Inuit curator from northern Quebec who's based in Montreal, and she has been doing this amazing work at taking objects from our films, photos from our films, all things that we've never shown publicly, and putting it together and putting it in a physical space and being able to show that, because a lot of people see the films, but then to see the objects within that context, I think is very interesting. And one thing that she's very aware of and that we've been talking about a lot is how to not recreate that dynamic of just, exposing Inuit as museological objects, and museological subjects, but sort of undermining that by creating events and sort of framing it within a different context. So that's something that we're exploring.
I think for home it's very simple. Keep it open and keep on making, and then because there are a lot of actually projects. For example, at FUFOC, so they're focusing on citizen space science, and right now they're working with NASA actually to.
You say that so lightly.
Yeah, because so they're working, I think, with NASA to make some works that are accessible for citizens to make themselves actually some signals, and that they can download and that they can modify it. And then for XX Lab, I think we continue the Soya Culture, because now there are a lot of demands, and we we move from just simple experiment into entrepreneurship, which is very hard actually.
Yes.
And
yeah, we keep to collaborate with so many people. I
So
think
many
we
people.
didn't like
just
make a
try to
boundary.
make it close. And then we also open a new lab right now in Jogja, which is and then new residency place and yeah, I think.
And you have a festival in December.
Yes, Sweat.
What is the festival?
It's called Transform Making. So it's critical making summit. It's focusing on critical making.
In the project that you're working on with NASA, can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's actually one of like called for Fox. So yeah, they are actually focusing on, because they are focusing on space science, but they are also focusing on citizen space science and hacktivism. So actually they make some devices and some performances and some works that actually they catch actually signals from outer space. So everybody from the children until grown up can modify also the signal, and then they can have it, and then they can, some actually they can download it, and then they can also produce also, and then they can develop it more. Everything also in Facebook. Also in our website, I think you can check all the activities that we do.
Great. Well, if there are no more questions from the audience, then I think that we will close. But thank you very much.
Thank everyone very, very much. This was a really fantastic panel and a wonderful moment to kind of reflect on what the next 25 years might bring for the Vera List Center. But I also really wanted to go back to what Sharif Kiwan actually said last night or yesterday afternoon, when he said that the prize is, it is an award, but it is also responsibility. And the responsibility lies very clearly, my perception, on us as cultural producers, curators and mediators, less on the artists. I think you particularly have proved this afternoon when we heard from 5 very different culture or artists associations about their work. Which is strong, diverse, very localized, internationally relevant, but it is on us, the curators, to make that work accessible and available, and to also find and create the audiences for it by developing different modes of talking about it, which create different audiences. So the act of mediation, I think, is one that is an enormous responsibility, and I feel heartened by seeing all of you invested in various aspects of it, and want to thank Amanda in particular for wonderfully shepherding us through this conversation. Now join us for food and drink. I think there is music, and I think at some point we also announce dance. So if you feel like dance, please. And we hope you'll be back tomorrow, 12 o'clock on the High Line, Tuesday, 12:30 in the gallery, and Thursday again for the lunchtime readings.
Where on the High Line?
30th Street.
Nggak ada. Nggak tahu.
Thank you all. Come back soon.